If you've been in internet theology circles for any time, you've probably heard the name James White. Mr. White has been attempting to refute the teachings of the Catholic Church for the better part of 30 years, having debated such figures as Jimmy Akin, Trent Horn, and many others, going all the way back to the 90s. Anyone who's familiar with his works knows that one of Mr. White's favorite defenses of his own authority is that he, quote, teaches church history.
Some of you may know that the first class I ever taught after I graduated from seminary at Grand Canyon back then, and was it university yet, or was it still just Grand Canyon College? I can't remember at that point in time, was church history.
This appeal is brought forward to guard his lackluster historical arguments from relevant criticism brought forth from a rigorous study of primary source materials. One of these claims that Mr. White defends in this way are the terrible calumnies he levels against Pope St. Zosimus, who was Roman pontiff from 417 to 418. Mr. White claims that Pope St. Zosimus fell into the heresy of Pelagianism when he had supposedly exonerated his follower Callistius in the year 417.
As I pointed out, Augustine not only never said, but the entire context of that was in the context of demonstrating that the church in North Africa stood firmly against Pope Zosimus, who claimed, I have fully examined this. Pelagius and Celestius, they're fine. I restore them. And the church in North Africa said no.
Further than this, he claims that the great doctor of grace, St. Augustine of Hippo, accused the Pope of heresy, convincing him eventually to change his mind the next year through the work of the Synod of Carthage in the year 418. Contrary to these calumnies from Mr. White, the Doctor of Grace always was the greatest defender of Pope St. Zosimus, recognizing that Callistius was a liar who had a history of purposefully misrepresenting his own views in order to try to be exonerated, which, according to Marius Mercator, an early ecclesiastical writer, he tried this in Carthage, Ephesus, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and finally, in Rome. Anyone who reads the primary sources, the documentation from St. Augustine, Pope St. Zosimus, the Synod of Carthage, and early historians who wrote on this matter would know this. Yet, unfortunately, Mr. White does not read any of these primary sources, but only a smattering of anti-Catholic polemical works, which blind him to the simple truth present in the historical narrative. But first, let's get some background information about the situation. For a fuller treatment of this era of church history, you can view my video called, quote, The Downfall of the Pelagians, but here I will outline the basics. Many have heard the name Pelagius, who was a heresiarch that opposed the traditional teaching of the church on justification, grace, and original sin. But less have heard the name Callistius. Callistius was basically the propagandist for Pelagius, who went throughout the Roman Empire defending him. Yet, after years of being subject to the scrutiny of many synods and the skillful pen of St. Augustine, things began to crack in the year 415. In 415, Pelagius had been caught in a trap. Callistius was far more explicit about the implications of the teaching of Pelagius, whereas Pelagius was more reserved about being able to state things in such a way as not to be condemned. Pelagius had been called to a synod at Diospolis, where he did his normal act of equivocation. Yet, the bishops at Diospolis had a way around this. Rather than presenting the more reserved statements of Pelagius, they presented to him the more explicit words of his friend Callistius. In response to this, Pelagius was caught between a rock and a hard place. He could either condemn his friend and save his own skin, vainly claiming that Callistius' teaching was different than his own, or, on the other hand, he could stand behind his friend and himself be condemned. Pelagius took the coward's way out and condemned his friend before the synod and in a letter to the Pope, and so was exonerated by the synod. News of this reached St. Augustine, and he recognized the trickery at hand and sent to St. John of Jerusalem, the head of the synod, a Greek copy of his own work against Pelagius on nature and grace, and a copy of the Acts of an earlier synod at Carthage, which condemned Pelagius, so that they could make a more informed decision on the matter. Along with this, he asked for the Acts of the Synod from St. John of Jerusalem, so he could confirm his suspicions. Upon receiving the Acts from St. John of Jerusalem, he wrote a work called On the Proceedings of Pelagius, where he confirmed these suspicions by the very text of the Acts. Beyond this, synods were called in Carthage and Mileve to renew this condemnation of Pelagius, and St. Augustine personally wrote a letter to Pope St. Innocent I, begging him to formally condemn Pelagius with his apostolic authority, in order to finally stamp out Pelagianism for good, recognizing the supreme authority of the Pope to judge in these matters. In January 417, the condemnation would come from Rome, where Pope St. Innocent I would condemn Pelagius and Cælestius as heretics, and excommunicated them unless they recant their errors. Famously, upon hearing the news, St. Augustine preached a sermon, Sermon 131, where he stated, quote, "About this case, 2 councils were sent to the Apostolic See, whence also responses came. The case is finished, if only the error were at some point finished. Therefore we warn that they may turn. We teach that they may be instructed. Let us pray that they may be changed." End quote. A more extensive treatment of this is found in his epistles. Now that Cælestius had basically been left out to dry, he had one last attempt to clear his name. In March of 417, Pope St. Innocent I had died, and Pope St. Zosimus was elected as his successor. So Cælestius traveled to Rome and told Pope St. Zosimus that he agreed with the letters recently issued by Pope St. Innocent. So, upon hearing this, Pope St. Zosimus sent letters to Africa, telling them that he saw no reason why Cælestius couldn't be reinstated, if he claimed to agree with Pope St. Innocent. So Pope St. Zosimus asked for them to send material showing that Cælestius was lying, or else he would be reinstated. The North Africans obeyed, and there was a synod at Carthage called in 418. Once the material from the synod was sent to Pope St. Zosimus, he clearly saw that Cælestius was a liar, and revoked the agreement to reinstate him. Beyond this, he actually promulgated a document that showed the broad extent of papal authority during the time, the Epistola Tractoria, which was promulgated to the entire world with the help of the Emperor Honorius, and signed by bishops throughout the entire world. Those refusing, such as Julian of Eclanum, were condemned. So, rather than being some sort of argument against the papacy, as we will see, the situations of Pope St. Innocent and Pope St. Zosimus show the eminent authority accorded to the Pope. So here we see that there are 3 central lies that uphold Mr. White's reading. 1. Mr. White claims that Cælestius presented Pelagian doctrine to Pope St. Zosimus, and that Pope St. Zosimus became a Pelagian. He did not. Rather, he presented the teaching of Pope St. Innocent, and lied about agreeing with it, which is evident from the primary sources, from Pope St. Zosimus' own words, the recollection of St. Augustine, the recollection of Marius Mercator, and the letter of Paulinus the deacon to Pope St. Zosimus. 2. Mr. White claims that Pope St. Zosimus supported the teaching of Cælestius. He did not. Rather, he conditionally agreed to reinstate him if the evidence given from the African synods did not definitively show that he was lying about his position, and truly did agree with what Pope St. Innocent wrote, due to the lack of standing that was in the original synod in Palestine. 3. Mr. White claims that St. Augustine in the Synod of Carthage condemned Pope St. Zosimus for heresy. Rather, they recognized the tricks of Cælestius, and just as St. Augustine had done a few years before with St. John of Jerusalem, St. Augustine presented the evidence in obedience to the Pope. As a bonus point to expose his utterly absurd reading of church history, Mr. White also claims, following Erik Svensson, that Pope St. Zosimus only condemned Pelagianism when he, quote, found out that his predecessor, Pope St. Innocent, had condemned them about a year earlier.
And eventually, once the civil authority got involved, and we can theorize as to how that is, he did a full turnaround. There have been many times the Bishop of Rome has said, this. Okay, later on, not this.
This reading is completely absurd, as the condemnation of Cælestius and Pelagius by Pope St. Innocent was widely known when it was issued, not some sort of private matter. It is absurd to pretend that Pope St. Zosimus, who was a priest in Rome before his election, would not have known about it. Further, the entire discussion was predicated on the fact that Cælestius lied about his affirmation of Pope St. Innocent's letters. Now that we have the background information out of the way, let's get into the actual comments that St. Augustine himself make about this controversy. He comments on the situation both during the controversy and at the end of his life in his work against Julian, showing that he kept a consistent view of the situation throughout his entire life, which is reflected in other primary sources during the time. He summarizes the situation well in his work against Julian, where he states, quote, "Why do you accuse Zosimus, of blessed memory, Bishop of the Apostolic See, of prevarication, to protect your own baseness? He was in accord with his predecessor, Innocent, whom you feared to mention. You preferred Zosimus because he dealt more leniently with Calastius at first, when Calastius promised to correct any of his statements that were unacceptable, and agreed to abide by the judgment of Innocent's letters." End quote. Notice there are two important clarifications that St. Augustine makes. First, he clarifies that the decision was not doctrinal, since he affirms that Pope St. Zosimus was, quote, "in accord with his predecessor Innocent." End quote. Second, he clarifies that Calastius had presented himself as agreeing with Pope St. Innocent. He comments on this issue at length in his On the Grace of Christ in Original Sin, Book 2. First, he introduces the topic stating, quote, "The Bishop Zosimus, however, who presided over this see, upon seeing him hurrying headlong in so great presumption like a madman, chose in his great compassion, with a view to the man's repentance, if it might be, rather to bind him tightly by eliciting from him answers to questions proposed by himself, than by the stroke of severe condemnation to drive him over the precipice, down which he seemed to be even now ready to fall. I say advisedly, down which he seemed to be ready to fall, rather than over which he had actually fallen, because he already, in the same book of his forecast, the subject with an intended reference to questions of this sort in the following words: If it should so happen that any air of ignorance has stolen over us human beings, let it be corrected by your decisive sentence." End quote. Here he states the original interaction between Pope St. Zosimus and Calastius, which we'll see more about later in the letter of Paulinus the Deacon. Calastius wrote an overview of his statements and was docile to correction, so Pope St. Zosimus hoped to heal him from his error. There is absolutely no sense of some sort of condemnation of Pope St. Zosimus here. In fact, St. Augustine is very clearly defending him in this passage. This agreement, along with other details which I presented above, are clear in the next chapter, where St. Augustine writes, quote, "The venerable Pope Zosimus, keeping in view this deprecatory preamble, dealt with the man, puffed up as he was, with the blasts of false doctrine, so as that he should condemn all the objectionable points, which had been alleged against him by the deacon Paulinus, and that he should yield his assent to the rescript of the Apostolic See, which had been issued by its predecessor of sacred memory. The accused man, however, refused to condemn the objections raised by the deacon, yet he did not dare to hold out against the letter of the blessed Pope Innocent. Indeed, he went so far as to promise that he would condemn all the points which the Apostolic See condemned. Thus, the man was treated with gentle remedies, as a delirious patient who required rest. But, at the same time, he was not regarded as being ready to be released from the restraints of excommunication, the interval of 2 months being granted him, until communications could be received from Africa. A place for recovery was conceded to him, under the mild restorative of the sentence which had been pronounced. For in truth, if he would have laid aside his vain obstinacy, and be now willing to carry out which he had undertaken, and would carefully read the very letter to which he had replied by promising submission, he would yet come to a better mind. But after the rescripts were duly issued from the council of the African bishops, there were very good reasons why the sentence should be carried out against him, in strictest accordance with equity. What these reasons were you may read for yourselves, for we have sent to you all the particulars." End quote. He actually adds interesting details in the next chapter, going on to describe Pelagius's attempts to trick Pope St. Zosimus. St. Augustine writes in the next chapter, quote, "Wherefore Pelagius too, if he will only reflect candidly on his own position and writings, has no reason for saying that he ought not to have been banned with such a sentence, for although he deceived the council in Palestine, seemingly clearing himself before it, he entirely failed in imposing on the church at Rome, where, as you well know, he is by no means a stranger, although he went so far as to make the attempt, if he might somehow succeed. But, as I have just said, he entirely failed. For the most blessed Pope Zosimus recollected what his predecessor, who had set him so worthy an example, had thought of these very proceedings. Nor did he omit to observe what opinion was entertained about this man by the trusty Romans, whose faith deserved to be spoken of in the Lord, and whose consistent zeal in defense of Catholic truth against heresy he saw prevailing among them with warmth, and at the same time most perfect harmony." End quote. St. Augustine always indicates that this move by Pope St. Zosimus was one of prudent consultation, not some sort of error, since the church in Carthage had dealt with the issue more extensively. He writes, quote, "But I would have you carefully observe the way in which Pelagius endeavored by deception to overreach even the judgment of the bishop of the Apostolic See on this very question of the baptism of infants. He sent a letter to Rome to Pope Innocent of blessed memory, and when it was found him not in the flesh, it was handed to the holy Pope Zosimus, and by him directed to us." End quote. In his work against two epistles of the Pelagians, addressed to Pope St. Boniface, St. Augustine exposes the lie that Pope St. Zosimus supported Calastius as a Pelagian error. Quote, "Moreover, they accused the Roman clergy. The Pelagians had conceived with a false hope that the new and detestable dogma of Pelagius or Calastius could be made acceptable to the Catholic intelligences of certain Romans, when those crafty spirits, however, perverted by a wicked error, yet not contemptible, since they appeared rather to be deserving of considerable correction than of easy condemnation, were treated with somewhat more of leniency than the strict discipline of the Church required. For while so many and such important ecclesiastical documents were passing and repassing between the Apostolical See and the African bishops, and moreover, when the proceedings in this matter in that see were completed, with Calastius present and making answer what sort of a letter, what decree is found of Pope Zosimus of venerable memory, wherein he prescribed that it must be believed that man is born without any taint of original sin. Absolutely, he never said this, never wrote it at all. But since Calastius had written this in his pamphlet among these matters, merely on which he confessed that he was still in doubt and desired to be instructed, the desire of amendment in a man of so acute an intellect, who, if he could be put right, would assuredly be of advantage to many, and not the falsehood of the doctrine, was approved. He, Calastius, replied that he consented to the letters of Pope Innocent of blessed memory, in which all doubt about this matter was removed. And in order that this might be made fuller and more manifest in him, matters were delayed until letters should come from Africa, in which province his craftiness had in some sort become more evidently known. And afterwards these letters came to Rome, containing this, that it was not sufficient for men of more sluggish and anxious minds that he confessed his general consent to the letters of Bishop Innocent, but that he ought openly to anathematize the mischievous statements which he had made in his pamphlet, lest, if he did not do so, many people of better intelligence should rather believe that in his pamphlet those poisons of the faith had been approved by the Catholic See, that is Rome, when his presence was demanded, in order that by certain and clear answers either the craft of the man or his correction might plainly appear and remain doubtful to no one. He withdrew himself and refused the examination. Neither would the delay which had already been made for the advantage of others have taken place, if it could not be of advantage to the pertinacity and madness of those who were excessively perverse. But if, which be far from the case, it had been so judged in the Roman Church concerning Calastius or Pelagius, that those dogmas of theirs, which in themselves and with themselves Pope Innocent had condemned, should be pronounced worthy of approval and maintenance, the mark of prevarication would rather have to be branded on the Roman clergy for this. But now, when the first letters of the most blessed Pope Innocent, in reply to the letters of the African bishops, would have equally condemned this error, which these men are endeavoring to commend to us, and his successor, the holy Pope Zosimus, would never have said, never have written, that this dogma which these men think concerning infants is to be held, nay, would even have bound Calastius by a repeated sentence, when he endeavored to clear himself, to a consent to the above-mentioned letters of the Apostolic See assuredly. Whatever in the meanwhile was done more leniently concerning Calastius, provided the stability of the most ancient and robust faith were maintained, was the most merciful persuasion of correction, not the most pernicious approval of wickedness. And then afterwards, by the same priesthood, Calastius and Pelagius were condemned by repeated authority, was the proof of a severity, for a little while intermitted, at length of necessity to be carried out, not a denial of a previously known truth, or a new acknowledgement of truth." End quote. There are quite a few important notes to note here besides what we already have gone over above. First and foremost, St. Augustine clearly notes a level of agreement with Pope St. Zosimus. There isn't a hint of critique in this overview. Rather, he notes that the Synod of Carthage simply encouraged Pope St. Zosimus to include additional condemnations of what Calastius had said previously. What was stated above about the letters to Carthage being one of consultation becomes evident as well, since those in Carthage had more experience with Calastius, since they were the ones who had originally condemned him a few years prior, whereas Rome had more experience with Pelagius, since he had resided there for many years. He mentions letters going back and forth of consultation, not some rebuke from the North Africans to Pope St. Zosimus. He continues in the next chapter, quote, "Who does not see in what degree Calastius was bound by the interrogations of your holy predecessor Zosimus, and by the answers of Calastius, whereby he professed that he consented to the letters of Pope Innocent, and fastened by a most wholesome chain, so as not to dare any further to maintain that the original sin of infants is not put away in baptism? Because these are the words of the venerable Innocent concerning this matter to the Carthaginian council, what could be more clear or more manifest than that judgment of the Apostolical See? To this Calastius professed that he assented, when it was said to him by your holy predecessor Zosimus, do you condemn all those things that are bandied about under your name? And he himself replied, I condemn them in accordance with the judgment of your predecessor Innocent of blessed memory. But he showed that he had answered deceitfully by the final event, when he withdrew himself from the examination, lest he should be compelled, according to the African rescripts, absolutely to mention and anathematize the very words themselves concerning this question which he wrote in his tractate." End quote. So it is completely dishonest to even speak of a, quote, disagreement. Rather, the Synod of Carthage gave a helpful suggestion so that the genuineness of Calastius' orthodoxy could be more particularly tested. This suggestion has been passed down as the canons of the Council of Carthage 418, which can be read in Denzinger or a number of places online. Now that we have went over St. Augustine's recounting of the events, which is the claim given by Mr. White, we can look at the actual epistles which support this reading. But before we get into these particular letters, we need to know more details about the synod that had condemned Calastius in Palestine. In the year 408, Emperor Constantine III had usurped the throne of the Western Roman Empire. In 411, this usurpation was put down by Constantius III. As a result, many of the bishops appointed by Constantine III were exiled, including two very important figures, Lazarus of Aix and Heroes of Arles. Both of these bishops were exiled to the east. In the year 415, St. John of Jerusalem called a synod in order to resolve the Pelagian crisis. This synod was spurred on by letters written by these two exiled bishops, yet for unknown reasons, they did not show up to the synod when summoned. St. Augustine had heard that this was due to illness, but there are other reports given in the historical literature. Either way, this led to an odd situation where Pelagius and Calastius had to be examined by 14 bishops under St. John of Jerusalem without the accusers present, which is known as an accusation done in absentia, which to a Roman was thought of as a terrible violation of due justice, where one had a right to face their accusers. The entire situation was a complete mess, with accusations done in absentia by foreign bishops who were considered suspect due to their exiled status, deceptive behavior from both Calastius and Pelagius, and the rejection of Calastius' doctrine by Pelagius. As mentioned before, rather than condemning St. John of Jerusalem and the Synod, St. Augustine recognized the difficulty in chapter 39 of his Proceedings of Pelagius, understanding how shady the entire situation sounded, writing, quote, "They, Lazarus and Hero, might perhaps have reminded him, St. John of Jerusalem, of something he had forgotten, or something in which he might have been deceived by the Latin interpreter, not, to be sure, for the purpose of misleading him by untruth, but at least owing to some difficulty occasioned by a foreign language only imperfectly understood." End quote. St. Augustine even admits in chapter 41 that he concedes that, in such difficult circumstances, he himself might have also exonerated them, stating, quote, "The same feeling might have occurred to ourselves also, if we had sat with them at the trial." End quote. Now 2 years after this entire mess, Calastius decided to travel to Rome, and a letter was sent by St. John's successor, Praelius, speaking well of Pelagius, along with a confession given by Pelagius. In order to decide this whole matter, which to this point suffered from lack of due process, St. Zosimus decided that there needed to be a long and deliberate process of investigation. So he sent 2 letters, mainly focusing on the case of Calastius. Besides this, he was informed of Lazarus and Hero in very negative terms, pointing to certain moral faults. This was made even worse by their involvement in the cases of St. Bryce of Tours and Bishop Proclus of Marseille. St. Bryce of Tours, the spiritual son of St. Martin of Tours, had been accused by Lazarus and others of various crimes. Upon traveling to Rome, the case was investigated, and St. Bryce was found innocent. Bishop Proclus of Marseille committed various canonical crimes and was very resistant to the authority of the Roman pontiff. While St. Augustine calls them our, quote, holy brethren, he had only heard of them from report. The first letter was written before September 21st, 417, and the second on September 21st, 417, both of which were sent to St. Aurelius of Carthage, who was responsible for the North African Church. In these letters, St. Zosimus rebukes the shenanigans that took place at Diospolis, especially the behavior of Lazarus and Hero, and requests that Africa send documentation so that he can make a right judgment. He begins the first letter, letter 45, by first recognizing the great responsibility and prudence he must show to his great authority as Pope, writing, quote, "A great responsibility and judgment requires great preparation, so that the balance of judgment may not fall short of the matters themselves that are under consideration. To this is added the authority of the Apostolic See, which, in honor of the most blessed Peter, the decrees of the fathers have established with particular reverence." End quote. He then introduces the topic, which was the improper condemnation that took place in the Synod of Diospolis. Quote, "Caelestius, a presbyter, presented himself for our examination, seeking to clear matters concerning himself that had been presented to the Apostolic See in an improper manner." End quote. After this, he tells them that he had examined the circumstances surrounding Diospolis and found it wanting, being content, for the time being, with the confession of Caelestius, who, as we will see, had sworn to uphold the previous definition of Pope St. Innocent, and subjected himself to the correction of the Apostolic See. Quote, "We examined all that had been previously done, as you will learn from the records attached to this letter. Caelestius presented his petition, which he had given us, and we had read it aloud. Not content with this, we repeatedly investigated whether what he had written he truly believed in his heart, or merely spoke with his lips." End quote. The last phrase of, quote, "whether he truly believed in his heart or merely spoke with his lips," is important since it indicates that Pope St. Zosimus considered Pelagianism to be heretical, and it was merely a fact-finding mission that he was on, which was already evident from the witness of St. Augustine, although we will see the same from the witness of Paulinus the deacon. This is evident when he continues to describe his chief complaint, which is the lack of due process considering the in absentia accusations of Hero and Lazarus, who, according to Caelestius, had never even met him, except in passing. He was even told that Hero and Lazarus had withdrawn their accusations, which explained this absence. He writes, quote, "Caelestius asserted that he had never had any discussions with the aforementioned persons regarding such matters, and claimed not to have known them before they wrote against him. He said that he had met Lazarus only in passing, and reconciled with Heroes, who acknowledged through the explanation that he had judged him wrongly, as someone unknown and absent. Heroes even added a gesture of satisfaction, withdrawing any prior misunderstanding." End quote. Further, he notes the incredible difficulty present with in absentia accusations. Quote, "It is enough to note that the accusations against an absent person, made by such individuals through letters, should be met with skepticism when the accused is present, explaining his faith and challenging his accuser." End quote. Rather than the mess which happened at Diospolis, St. Zosimus wants to hold a proper investigation, which are in line with the careful consideration necessary for such an important matter, which of course is understandable. Quote, "Rarely does prolonged and carefully considered deliberation fail to arrive at the truth. It is a sign of the best mind to be slow in believing what is evil, for often when trust is denied to a good confession, individuals are driven into despair, and harm becomes irreparable. In the present case, we deem nothing premature or rash, but wish your holiness to know the outcome of our examination regarding Caelestius's faith." End quote. In order to have a proper investigation, he needed a proper accuser present. Now, due to the fact that the main combat against Pelagianism had taken place in North Africa, it was obvious that he needed to have documentation from North Africa, and namely from the original accuser, that is, Paulinus. So he wrote to them that he needed such documentation within 2 months, writing, quote, "A prior petition from him within Africa should have been available as testimony before us. Therefore, within 2 months, let those who accuse him come forward and demonstrate that he holds beliefs contrary to what he has declared in his petitions and profession. Otherwise, after such open and manifest declarations, your holiness may know that doubts have been resolved." End quote. He also adds a note that he had chastised Caelestius for his silly behavior. Now, this wasn't the only letter that was written. An update was sent on September 21st, 417, where he wrote about the case of Pelagius, who had recently been supported in his cause by the Bishop of Jerusalem, and sent a libellus outlining his views. Pope St. Zosimus states that the libellus expressed orthodoxy, which is probably true, or at least had enough of an appearance of orthodoxy. The idea that this contained Pelagian doctrine is an absurd notion, both from what Paulinus the deacon says, from what was said in the previous letter, from the ordinary behavior of Pelagius, and from the interpretation of St. John of Jerusalem's behavior given by St. Augustine when he wrote his work on the proceedings of Pelagius. He goes on to state more about what he had heard about Heroes and Lazarus. Now, whether these statements are true or not is up to debate, although it should be noted that, after these letters were sent, there was no defense of Heroes and Lazarus given by the North Africans or anyone else. Rather, the only defense comes from a brief statement on the proceedings of Pelagius, written before the letters of Pope St. Zosimus had been sent. While the original epistles are written on or before September 21st, 417, the response did not come until November 8th, 417, via the libellus written by Paulinus the deacon, friend of St. Augustine and former scribe of Ambrose, who wrote an early hagiography of the saint. The reason that Paulinus the deacon in particular was the one who responded in the name of the African Church was, as Marcus Mercator notes, the fact that he was the one who had originally accused him in the African Synod years before. So Pope St. Zosimus was particularly asking for the accuser to witness, which had failed to happen in the case of Lazarus and Heroes. Now, were Mr. White's description of the situation correct, we should see some rebuke of Paulinus the deacon of Pope St. Zosimus for supporting Pelagianism. Well, what we actually see is the opposite. He begins the epistle with a powerful acknowledgement of the Pope's authority to judge this matter. Quote, "The true faith is never disturbed, especially in the Apostolic Church, where the teachers of false faith are quickly and truthfully punished. They are made to put to death within themselves whatever they have conceived wrongly and brought forth worse, so that the true faith taught by the apostles and held by the Roman Church, along with all the teachers of the Catholic faith, may live in them. If, like other authors of heresies who have already been judged by the Apostolic See or the Fathers and cast out of the embrace of the Catholic Church to perish in eternal death, these individuals now detected, or being detected, persist in their perfidy, let them be handed over to the spiritual sword for destruction." End quote. He then goes on to recall the condemnation given by Pope St. Innocent, and actually affirms what St. Augustine would later record, that is, that Pope St. Zosimus only agreed to exonerate them if they were to assent to the judgment previously given by Pope St. Innocent, which they agreed to. Quote, "Following this judgment of Pope St. Innocent, your blessedness," that is, Pope St. Zosimus, "when hearing Cælestius at the Apostolic See, commanded with these words among others, 'Do you therefore condemn all these things contained in Paulinus's petition regarding the issues?' And elsewhere, have you understood what letters the See has sent to our brothers and co-bishops of the African province? It was added, 'Do you condemn all we have condemned and hold to what we hold?' And again, 'Do you condemn all those things raising concerning your name?' And further, 'What about the matters exposed in Paulinus's petition?'" End quote. Here he is describing the process in which Cælestius was investigated by Pope St. Zosimus, which St. Augustine noted earlier, a rigorous process that involved a full-throated condemnation of Pelagianism. Going on, he writes, quote, "When you declared, through the authority of the Holy Spirit, that I could be approved as orthodox, while rejecting and suppressing the insane and slanderous words of one raving, you gave a decision which could heal him, Cælestius, if you wished. Your judgment," that is, Pope St. Zosimus, "was as follows. I do not want you to evade the issue, condemn all these things attributed to you by Paulinus, or spread through rumor. Who would not be satisfied with such a judgment? Who would reject the wholesome, agreeable, and pious decision, that is, the decision of Pope St. Zosimus, except one who had deviated from the faith?" End quote. In fact, rather than interpreting this as a support of Pelagianism, he interprets this as a second condemnation of Pelagianism, writing, quote, "I give thanks to God and to Christ our Lord, who has willed that the cause of his church be conducted so that the Apostolic See, through the voice of 2 of its pontiffs, has condemned heresy and commanded the condemnation of these things I'd accused Cælestius of. I have always and still desire not his condemnation, but his correction." End quote. This is something supported by Marius Mercator, the great historian of the Pelagian controversy, who defended St. Augustine in both Greek and Latin, and was commended by the Council of Ephesus. In his Commentatorium, he writes, quote, Caelestius, after being expelled from there as well, went in haste to the city of Rome, during the pontificate of holy Zosimus of blessed memory. There, in proceedings of which we possess copies, he was interrogated. Though somewhat intimidated by the examiner, his repeated responses and explanations gave the impression that he intended to condemn the propositions for which he had been accused at Carthage. This was something he was firmly urged to do, and for this reason he was treated with great degree of leniency by the holy priest and obtained a letter of goodwill addressed to the African bishops. However, he abused, and perhaps continues to abuse, this letter to deceive many ignorant people. End quote. He then goes on to describe the remedying of the judicial impediment by his own appearance to accuse Caelestius in person. Yet Caelestius did not show up, so he was not able to have a proper hearing of the case, which Paulinus states as evidence of his deceptive behavior. Quote, at that time, I could do nothing because the one who had appealed to the Apostolic See failed to appear. He should have substantiated the merits of his appeal, especially since even by human law, the superior party is always the one who prevails when the appellant fails to act. What further concern did I have to support his false doctrine before your reverence, when I could instead rejoice if he had merited absolution by condemning what I had accused him of, as the judgment of the Apostolic See has confirmed? But he has always been a cunning fox, intent on fraud. He cannot change his nature, believing he cannot be detected, because he always places his confidence in his hiding places, where he tries to conceal his guilty conscience. But he can no longer remain hidden. His deeds are now manifest, and are being cut off by the spiritual sword of your blessedness, so that the Lord's flock, divided by his ravenous teeth, may no longer be torn apart. End quote. In order to better deal with the situation, a synod was called by St. Aurelius of Carthage. Various different letters and other information was collected together by the North African bishops, who at this point had been dealing with this controversy for over 5 years. These were sent to the Apostolic See, and in March of 418, St. Zosimus sends a letter back. This letter begins with a restatement of his supreme authority to judge in this matter, yet his prudence in consulting the bishops of North Africa. He writes, quote, although the tradition of the fathers has granted such authority to the Apostolic See that no one dares to dispute its judgment, and this has always been upheld by canons and rules, the ecclesiastical discipline that continues to function under its own laws pays the due reverence to the name of Peter, from whom it also descends. Canonical antiquity, through the judgments of all, willed that this apostle should have such great power, rooted in the promise of Christ our God, that he might bind what is loosed and loose what was bound. Equal power was granted to those who, with his consent, merited the inheritance of his see. Indeed, he has care not only for all churches, but especially for this one where he sat. He does not allow the privileges he established to waver, or the judgments he fixed to falter, having laid the firm foundation of his name, which remains unshaken by any storms. With Peter as the head of such authority, and the rulings of all the great ones following him, it was established by human and divine law that the Roman Church, which occupies his place, should retain the power of his name. End quote. He goes on to assure the Africans that he is taking into consideration all the information that is being sent from them, and that he wasn't uncritically believing everything that Caelestius said, writing, quote, after receiving the letters sent through your subdeacon Marcellinus, we examined the entire volume. Upon reading it thoroughly, you seem to interpret the entirety of the correspondence as if we had granted uncritical faith to Caelestius in all things, agreeing to his every word without examining it down to the last syllable. End quote. He then encourages them to patience, since such examinations, if done prudently, take a long time, as he noted earlier. Although, if you recall from the letter of Paulinus the deacon, the foundations were already crumbling for Caelestius, since he had refused to face his accusers when sent. On April 29, 418, the letter from Zosimus is received. Finally, Carthage was able to issue its canons, sending them a few days later to Rome, in order to help with the examination of Caelestius. Yet, during this time, something significant happened. The Emperor Honorius condemned Pelagius and Caelestius in order that they be placed under house arrest, not being permitted to leave Rome. Pelagius, who presumably was in Rome at this time, stays, while Caelestius flees Rome. As St. Posidius, in his Life of Augustine, witnesses, This was something that was in response to a judgment made by Pope St. Zosimus. Therefore, presumably, the judgment was already made by the time the final examination took place via the canons of the Council of Carthage. He writes, quote, "When they perversely tried through their flattery to persuade the Apostolic See of their false doctrine, it was most positively resolved by successive African councils of holy bishops, first to convince the Venerable Innocent, the holy Pope of the city, and his successor, the holy Zosimus. When the most pious Emperor Honorius heard of this judgment, which had been passed upon them by the Catholic Church of God, influenced by it, he in turn decreed that they should be condemned by his laws and should be regarded as heretics. Accordingly, some of them returned to the bosom of the Holy Mother Church, which they had withdrawn from." End quote. Marius Mercator also describes this in his Commentatorium, stating, quote, "When the African bishops wrote back, explaining the entire case that had taken place before them, and sending the relevant records that had been drawn up regarding him, Cælestius was summoned to a fuller hearing. He was asked to fulfill his promises by condemning the aforementioned propositions, so that he might be absolved from the sentence of the African bishops by which he had been excluded from communion. Not only did he fail to appear, but he also fled from the city of Rome. For this reason, he was condemned in the most extensive and severe writings of the aforementioned Zosimus of blessed memory, which included the very propositions of which he was accused, and narrated the entire case concerning both Cælestius and his even more corrupt teacher Pelagius. We have copies of these writings in our possession, and similar writings were sent to the bishops of the Eastern churches, the dioceses of Egypt, Constantinople, Thessalonica, and Jerusalem." End quote. Now, when the canons were received from Rome, St. Zosimus attempted to call Cælestius to answer whether he assented to these accusations or not, but he, as I mentioned, had already fled and did not come back. Further, Pelagius refused to assent. Therefore, in order to resolve this whole controversy, St. Zosimus wrote his famous Tractoria, sent to the bishops of the entire world, that they might sign on to Augustinian doctrine. Now, there are other topics related to the papacy that are quite interesting to discuss, such as the mission which was given by Pope Zosimus to St. Augustine in 418, or the other comments made about papal authority after the condemnation given by Pope St. Innocent I, or the nature of the Tractoria, but I will save those for a later video. As always, God bless.